Hi everyone, good evening. Yeah. This is our last public program of the calendar year, so yes, good evening. So welcome to Smokehouse Associates Writers Forum with Eric Booker, Charles Davis, Ashley James, and James Trainor. My name is Dan Huff, and I'm Director of Public Programs at the Studio Museum in Harlem. And on behalf of the museum and the public programs team of Melanie Graham, Naomi Amunafisea, and Maya Weitz, we'd like to thank you so much for joining us. We'd also like to extend a huge thanks to the entire Storefront team for so generously hosting and collaborating with us on today's program, which, given the ideologies, intentions, and nature of the Associates' work, Storefront was an ideal venue. This program is being recorded, and ASL interpretation is generously provided by Pro Bono ASL and DeafLink. So could I ask for a show of hands who was familiar with the Smokehouse Associates prior to this program? You're in for a treat. Great. So today's program is the second program in celebration of the release of Studio Museum's new publication, Smokehouse Associates. If you haven't seen them, those gorgeous books are for sale in the back and on Studio's website right now. Our first program took place in September and featured the three members of the Smokehouse Associates, William T. Williams, Mel Edwards, and Guy Chiartia, in conversation with Eric Booker. If you're curious, that program is currently on Studio's website and is an absolute viewing must. Today's program will begin with a brief overview of the history of the Smokehouse Associates by Eric Booker, tonight's moderator, and the publication's editor, before opening up the floor for individual presentations from the publication's three writers, Charles L. Davis II, James Trainor, and Ashley James, in that order. Each writer's presentation will contextualize and expand the Smokehouse Associates in relation to their own research interests and areas of study. After the individual presentations, there will be an open conversation amongst the panelists, and then we'll open things up to audience questions. Before I hand things off to Eric, let me share a bit about our speakers. Charles L. Davis II, PhD, is an associate professor of architectural history and criticism at the University of Texas at Austin. His academic research excavates the role of racial identity and race thinking in architectural history and contemporary design culture. He is the author of Building Character, The Racial Politics of Modern Architectural Style, and co-editor of Race and Modern Architecture, A Critical History from the Enlightenment to the Present. His current book project recovers the overlooked contributions of Black artists and architects in shaping the built environment, from the Harlem Renaissance to Black Lives Matter. James Trainor is a writer, educator, and scholar of the history of contemporary culture, design, architecture, and urbanism. His writing has appeared in numerous publications, including Art Forum, Art in America, Bomb, Cabinet, Metropolis, and Frieze, where he was U.S. editor and a senior staff writer. The author of multiple monographic essays and exhibition catalogs, Trainor has lectured at numerous institutions such as Columbia University, Cornell University, and University of Southern California. He is a recipient of an Arts Writers Grant from Creative Capital, Andy Warhol Foundation for the Arts, a Graham Foundation for Advanced Studies in the Fine Arts Grant, and 2 McDowell Colony Fellowships, among other awards. He is currently working on Steal This Playground, New York City and the Radical Play Movement, 1960 to 1978, forthcoming from Princeton Architectural Press in 2023. Ashley James, PhD, is Associate Curator, Contemporary Art at the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum. She is the curator of Off the Record and co-curator of the Hugo Boss Prize 2020 Dina Lawson Centropede. Previously, James served as Assistant Curator, Contemporary Art at the Brooklyn Museum, where she curated its presentation of Sullivan Nation, Art in the Age of Black Power, and Eric N. Mack, Let Me Walk Across the Room, and co-curated John Edmonds' A Side Long Glance. James also served as a Mellon Curatorial Fellow in Drawing and Prints at the Museum of Modern Art, where her work focused on the groundbreaking retrospectives of Adrian Piper and Charles White. She's held positions at the Studio Museum in Harlem and at the Yale University Art Gallery, where she co-organized the exhibition Odd Volumes, book art from the Alan Chasnoff collection. James holds a BA from Columbia University and a PhD from Yale University in English Literature and African American Studies with a certificate in Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. And last but not least, Eric Booker is a curator and writer. His work makes space for artists and narratives that challenge dominant histories. Booker is former assistant curator and exhibition coordinator at the Studio Museum in Harlem, where he worked on a range of exhibitions, performances, public art, and site-specific installations. His curatorial projects include Method over Metric at the National Academy Museum, Jamel Chapaz's Crossing 125th, Smokehouse 1968 to 1970, and Regarding the Figure at the Studio Museum in Harlem. Inside Out Here at La Mama Galleria, and Autumn Night Wall at the Studio Museum in Harlem and Dance Space Project. Booker is currently Associate Curator at Storm King Art Center. Eric, take it away.
Can you guys hear me? Oh, great. Thanks so much, Dayan, and thank you everyone for being here. It's so great to gather together around this project for the first time in person. So really excited to have you all here and the writers here tonight. As Dayan said, I'm Eric Booker, Assistant Curator and Exhibition Coordinator, formerly at the Studio Museum, now Associate Curator at Storm King, and editor of the book that we're focusing on tonight. I want to, of course, thank our gracious hosts, first and foremost, Storefront for Art and Architecture, for having us here this evening. Storefront's multidisciplinary program hums the same tune as Smokehouse through its exploration of the built environment at the intersections of art, architecture, and public life. I couldn't think of a better place to gather and consider Smokehouse's work tonight. Thank you to the Storefront team, Guillermo Ruiz de Teresa, Jose Esparza Chanqui, Eduardo Meneses, and Jessica Kwok, and of course, endless gratitude to the Studio Museum team for their support both here and on the Smokehouse program series to date. Dayan Huff, Naomi Amenu-Faseha, Habiba Hobson, Simon Griesus, Melania Graham, and Maya Weitz. And last but not least, to our brilliant panelists and Smokehouse authors this evening, Charles Davis II, Ashley James, and James Trainor. Thank you so much for being here tonight and for your incredible contributions to this book. The Smokehouse Associates project takes on a difficult task, and I'm just going to kind of slide through some of the images here, to document, contextualize, and ultimately bring forth the work of a little-known public art collective whose work no longer exists outdoors. Envisioned by the artist William T. Williams in 1968, the Smokehouse Associates created participatory public art projects in Central and East Harlem that transform the urban landscape through dynamic abstract murals and sculptures, creating these vibrant environments that radiate with the sense of potential, as you can really gather from the photographs. The collective comprised 4 members: Williams, Melvin Edwards, Guy Charcha, and Billy Rose. However, Smokehouse's membership was free-form and elastic. If you wanted to clean up the site, paint a wall, or lend your expertise in some way, you became a part of the group's infectious mission of change. The artists enlisted block associations, community elders, and neighborhood youth to help them complete approximately 9 projects throughout the Harlem community. Abstraction was also important to this. The group's explicit choice to pursue a non-representational idiom amid the height of Black power and social realism was arguably a radical gesture in and of itself, creating a liberatory space that amplified the community's ideas. This work, with its vibrant colors and hard-edged geometries, drew from a variety of cultural, architectural, and vernacular sources, at once reflecting the aesthetic diversity of the environment and affirming art's intrinsic place in the world around us. While the exuberant photographs you see here remain the only visual documentation of the group's work, They inherently fall short of the physical walls and the spaces themselves. And without them, the image becomes something else, an imitation, to look past and imagine what happened in the round, how these sites would have opened up aesthetic and emotional dimensions for the people who experienced them in Harlem. This process of remembrance and recovery would not have been possible without the artists themselves, who have generously shared their time and memories over the course of this project, and many of which are now reflected in the excellent round table that Ashley has moderated in the book, as well as other archival materials that illustrate the practical implications and political realities that Smokehouse navigated to achieve this work. This, in concert with the chronology that situates Smokehouse alongside concurrent artistic, architectural, and social movements, begins to formulate a dynamic picture of a group of artists who understood a bold yet simple mission: to change their environment. The Smokehouse Associates publication, which you see here, and which Dan pointed out is on sale in the back, brings together a diverse group of thinkers across the worlds of art, architecture, and urban design. Its purpose is to not only reintroduce and reinscribe the collective's contributions to art history, but to carry this decentralizing, capacious spirit forward. As we will see in each of the panelists' presentations tonight, Smokehouse still holds the potential, over 50 years later, to expand our understanding of disciplinary histories across art and architecture. Their outdoor work continues to defy easy categorization, and in that, they open up a seemingly endless avenue of inquiry. And with that, I will turn it over to Charles to get us started. There's just a few spreads of the book here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Studio Museum Harlem, and Storefront for Architecture for convening this here. And I want to thank Eric particularly for inviting me to contribute to this essay, because it's challenged me to think a little bit differently about how I want to contribute to architectural history after doing a couple of books that essentially critique the whiteness of the discipline and the kinds of definitions of architectural expertise that limits who we think of as authors of the built environment. And with Smokehouse Associates, I see an opportunity to open the annals of authorship to consider other types of contributors. And so what I really liked about Smokehouse Associates, which I'll show you both in this slide and subsequent slides, are the ways that they help us to complicate the history of post-war avant-garde utopianism, particularly. Here in this slide, on the left and right, we're looking at images from Archigram, which is a post-war British avant-garde group. And what they really tried to do was to reapply the technologies of war, particularly post-war military technologies, to the construction of public place. And the idea was to take what was destructive and to make it constructive. And for me, what was really nice about Smokehouse Associates is that they were doing something similar with far simpler economy of meanings, taking paint and abstraction, and my particular essay was called The Social Life of Abstraction, looking at the ways that those things help to stage the revitalization of Black spaces, particularly Black urban spaces. And for me, particularly, what I see is a genealogy of Black authors who are not architects, not planners, but who work at an urban scale and who work at an architectural scale. And just like with Smokehouse Associates, they include folks who were part of community organizations, local youth groups. I'm not going to call them gangs, right, like they typically would label them as, but people who were invested in the neighborhood, coming together, working with professionals, giving folks on-the-ground expertise in order to transform the place. For me, I think that there's a missing history of this work. Now, we have Smokehouse Associates because they were affiliated with a local art institution. They helped establish the Studio Museum Harlem. They were part of artistic institutions that helped to keep their memory alive. But there's a whole host of people who work artistically on plays, who disappear. And so I think what we need to do is to recalibrate our histories, which are now siloed between disciplinary histories of architectural expertise, utopianism, and at least in this case, post-war protest literatures. People like Paul Marshall, Jim Jordan, and Mary Baraka, working at the same period, all borrowing the language of architectural modernism, all borrowing the language of space. And what we need to do is we need to create an interdisciplinary history of this type of work. That way, instead of privileging the notion of who has a license or who is trained to use drawings and models, we actually talk about who authors the built environment. And I think this complicates the story of what is the architectural response to modernity in these spaces. So, in particular, we were challenged here today to talk about the ways that this essay expanded our work and where it's taking us currently. So, I looked at my first two books, the books that were mentioned, Building Character and Race and Modern Architecture, as a critique of whiteness in our profession. This work allows me to now invest in the curation of blackness in our profession and the ways that folks who may not have had a license but still contributed to this work can be chronicled. And so a couple of things I'm doing now. One is at UT Austin, we'll be starting an archive, a digital archive called the Black Space Archive, purposefully looking at works not completed by licensed architects, but starting with people who are Black artists, Black entrepreneurs, and then working our way all the way down to folks who were running community development corporations, and even radical homemakers, to try and get a sense of who was contributing to the built environment in an ephemeral archive that we would like to make more permanent. And so we're working with the Black Diaspora Archive, run by Black Studies in the department in the College of Liberal Arts, as well as the Alexander Architectural Archive at UT Austin to document this work. I think that it will include people such as Amanda Williams, Olalekan Ifus, Gaster Gates, Rick Lowe, people who have come to slowly be recognized by our profession as contributing to this work, as sort of national figures, but then opening the way for us to introduce a larger spectrum, a larger archive of work. And we're purposefully following the model outlined by the Federal Writers Project that use oral histories, as well as tabs-like documentation of sites to create an archive that can then be disseminated, particularly in a form that architects can understand and that could influence and inform their work. And so this is just giving you a sense of who we're including in this list, both a list of some of the practitioners that were mentioned. Smokehouse Associates will also be one of them. We even are looking at folks or housing situations like the headquarters for the Black Panther Party and the different types of mixed use elements that took place within those spaces, as well as different notions of the home that has been reconstructed by both local practitioners and national practitioners. And so we're starting with two demonstration projects. The first is the Black home itself as a kind of cultural project, looking for the ways that modernity is indexed in the spaces, as well as trying to visually map some of the sites of civil rights protests in the Green Book itself. And so we're collaborating with folks both in UT Austin and in the South who are doing that work. The other thing that I'm working on now is a second volume, which looks at the ways that architecture has been able to establish itself through the lens of Black modernity by looking at case studies related to Black social movements. And by using the social movements as the lens through which to understand how professionals collaborated with one another, then we have an opportunity to take the attention away from architects per se and to look at a broader base cultural project of shaping the built environment. And in one of the chapters, so one chapter deals with the work of Smokehouse Associates in relation to people like James Trainor and Mary Baraka and some of the utopian these ideas that are there. Another chapter looks at the ways that the Harlem Renaissance was put forward by the labor of Black women, and particularly Black women who were engaged in forms of philanthropy, although not at the scale that we tend to acknowledge it these days. And so this includes, for example, the contributions of Madam C.J. Walker, who was one of the first, who was the first woman millionaire, first Black woman millionaire in the U.S. But when looking at her story, what I find really interesting are the ways that she both had to legitimize the work of care that Black women did in the minds of not only white philanthropists, but even in the mind of Black philanthropists. And so there's lots of accounts of her speaking with people in Booker T. Washington and trying to get him to take seriously the type of work that she did, as well as the ways that she positioned Black women to become entrepreneurs, to own their own labor, and to build their own capital, using the very work that they would do in their homes that was never acknowledged as a formal sense of wage labor. What I really like about this particular chapter is that instead of privileging the works of the Black architects who designed most of her well-known spaces, which is Vernon Tandy, both the Dark Tower in New York City as well as Villa Lawaro, which became a kind of signature project to demonstrate the potential of African Americans in the Harlem Renaissance. If you go all the way back to her humble origins, before she made any money at all, starting in 1867 with her family house on the Barney Plantation, moving to her own house, and you can see there in that image, there's a plaque showing her name. This is the Madam C.J. Walker house itself. And then looking on to the Walker Salon at home, and then later Villa Lawaro. What's interesting about these spaces is that the programs that were combined together, the domestic part of the home, as well as the business parts of the home. Initially, looking at the use of laundry, she sort of moved from laundry and cleaning onto hair care. And for me, what's really interesting is both the visual presentation of Blackness as a modernizing force through hair care, which in and of itself for her was a scientific venture. How do you mix things, how do you use that mixture and reproduce it within warehouses, and then disseminate that to the public. And then her own self-presentation as a person transformed into this new modern personage. This comes through in the architectural works itself. And for me, at least, the types of programs that were combined, not only in these early houses, but in this later example, really should be credited to Madam C.J. Walker, not to the architect who gave it form. And so, at the very least, there's a co-authorship of what's happening that began early in this woman's career, starting with her own legitimization of Black female philanthropy, and then finding architectural form. And for me, what's really interesting as I move across case studies is I'm starting to find that architectural form is one of the last modes by which Black modernity starts to get expressed. It is really in the spatial complexities and the social networking that we start to see the foundations for these elements. And so I'm starting to use this scholarship to move away from architectural formalism. What does Blackness look like? To a kind of spatial notion of Blackness, which is how does it operate? How does it connect certain things? And how does it build a protocol that architects later come to formalize? So at the very least, architects are referencing precedents, and in the best cases, when they're speaking with their clients, they're co-authoring these elements. I think that this offers a way of reforming both architectural education and architectural practice that I think it would be productive for the future. So, without this essay, I don't think I would have been able to articulate those things. It's been kind of a hinge point for me. So I really appreciate the opportunity. And I hope you guys, if you haven't had a chance, at least read through the article, the essays that are there, and to see some of the work. I think it's a very good precedent for the future. Thank you very much.
don't know if anyone noticed that Charles and I coordinated outfits. That's no mistake. Thanks also, thank you Charles, that was great. And thanks again to Eric and everyone in the studio and Storefront for having us here and giving a platform for this amazing book, which you have to buy from the building. So, microphone? Okay. Good. Is this good? Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Good. I'd like to start with this slide. I like starting with the slide, but I don't do this. Usually, just because coming from where I'm coming from, which is the study of play and urban play, I can't think of two pictures that more perfectly encapsulate this, not dichotomy, but this relationship between play and art and play, art, play, which is which, and does it really matter? And more importantly, to these particular kids, does it matter to them growing up at whatever age they are? These are two different places in the same city, in this city in New York. In 1967, one in the winter, one in the summer. But do they need there to be a difference between the two? Because there is both very calibrated art within an architectural setting, inviting play, but that is indistinguishable for these children, I believe, based on my research and my own personal experience, that at that age, it is all synthesized. It becomes part of a play experience, especially in an urban context. So I thought at the time that I had, oh, by the way, you should know, I have enough material here to go on for about 7 hours. So there's going to be a hard stop. And I'm going to be taken off the stage. That's fine, I've agreed to it. But I just want you to know if that's going to happen. Also, images to look up. So, but I want to tell you a bit of where I'm coming from and how it led me not back to Smokehouse, but how it led me to Smokehouse in the first place. My research has, for the past several years, been about the history of playgrounds in New York City, and specifically what could be termed the playground revolution and the radical play movement in the 1960s and 70s. The book, this is all going into a book that will be published next year by Houston Architectural Press, entitled Still This Playground, with the long subtitle, New York City and the Radical Play Movement, 1916 and 1978. I'll explain the 78 later. But this was a golden age for reimagining public space through the prism of play, through the pinch point of play, and designing for children. And designing for urban play, and it lasted nearly, almost, arguably 2 decades. Today, it is nearly forgotten. And which is, this seems like an appropriate place to talk about things that are nearly forgotten, and that had to be re-excavated to realize, to demonstrate just how important they were. Nearly all of the visible vestiges of the legacy of this revolution that took place are gone today. What we have, as with the legacy of Smokehouse, are photographs, oral histories, deep volumes and archives of documentation, the indelible memories of those who survived, both the practitioners and those who were there, and a lot of hard work by people like Eric Booker, And this research in terms of my research, has been quite a rabbit hole. It has led me to the discovery of the New York invention, arguably, of the Best Pocket Park and the Best Pocket Playground in the modern sense. And the concept of brutalist hardscape adventure playgrounds that used to dot the city, and how those that exist still today are whittled down, watered down versions. Existence of handmade playgrounds, the birth of play streets, and adjacent to that, to the municipally supported grassroots projects of bringing or facilitating culture directly to the streets. Theater, dance, film, music, books, readings, the creation of poetry, you name it, starting in the mid to late 60s. All of these things combined, and there are more things, more taxonomies of play and urban play that you could think of, created an idea of the city as itself a play space, a thing to be played. That this previously post-industrial city, this drab workaday city of the 40s, 50s, and even into the early 60s, could be transformed into something that could be enjoyed and could be played. And most pointedly, to this gathering, it was a moment that I saw. It was, what am I saying here? This is this part of this morning. It was a moment that saw the introduction of, of course, it's only important, the introduction of abstract public art into the streets and into the outdoor environments and into the lives of the citizenry of the city in a way that had never been done before. In fact, it hadn't been done before. Overarchingly, my research has led to the revelation that the city, during this brief age of experimentation and progressive optimism, attempted and often succeeded in reinventing public space, often where it was needed the most and where it had been so lacking for so long. All of this was possible only thanks to a quiet coup against the old guard that dominated and controlled and held power in the city, the entrenched establishment, which up and into the early years of the 1960s still existed. And they were opposed by a new emergent generation of designers, artists, architects, social workers, church leaders, visionary grassroots activists of every stripe, civil rights leaders, community organizers, reform politicians, and everyday citizens of the city, coming together in all sorts of unlikely alliances and coalitions and you get the point. Using this thin edge for social change that was designing for children. It was the thin edge that nobody could argue with because it was for the welfare of the city's children. And that was the one place where social reform and social change and how it could be expressed through changes in the built environments was the hardest to argue with. So to answer my original question, because there was one, how it led me to Smokehouse Associates originally. It was 2 very long weeks of visits, going through boxes of the archives at the Public Art Fund, which are housed at the Fales Library at NYU. And it was there that I found, not these photographs, but 2 documents two documents that were, this is one, a photo essay, Street Art New York, published by the Department of Parks, published by the city, published by the Department of Parks, and how it was then termed the Department of Parks, Recreation and Cultural Affairs. This was published in the summer, at the end of the summer of 1968, to document photographically and with selective texts what had happened in New York City that concerned the idea of the expanded field of play in all the ways that I tried to describe earlier. And the second was this one, which is one double-page spread from an exhibition catalog published by the Jewish Museum for an exhibition called Using Walls Outdoors in 1970 with an amazing essay in it by Dory Ashton. Now, these two, this and this. This one's from the first one. This is from Street Art New York. And this is from the Jewish Museum catalog. And these two, I've already, by the point that I've seen these things in the archive, I've seen so many images of so many things. And yet I had never seen stuff like this. Not this kind of space, which was clearly in the making, nor this. And these two images were sort of my road to Damascus moment. The sort of ocular proof positive of what I'd suspected was a direct line between the exuberance, for want of a better word, of urban play, the promise of public fun, and the unleashed, eye-popping dynamism and visual energy and passion and full throttle, go for broke, sexiness of art like this, that was bold and abstract in a whole new direction, and that it was the two were in direct relationship intentionally with one another. The two were integrated and sharing space with each other on purpose. Play, children, and this. I've seen many examples of other types of spaces. I recognized this for what it was, Best Pocket Park, or one that was under construction, but never in conjunction with this type of art making. And yes, so later when I saw Mel Edwards' abstract play sculptures placed in these, specifically in this spot and in others along 121st Street in Harlem, it all fell into place for me personally in conjunction with everything else that I had been studying. And of course, I felt that, of course, this had to exist. If it hadn't existed, if I hadn't had proof, I would have had to invent it myself, because it was the sort of the glue that brought everything together. And being given, well, we're not going to get to everything here tonight, but okay. One note on the old art before we depart. Old art. All you need to know, 2 words. Robert Moses. You all know Robert Moses. You don't need a bio on him, but I do want to point out that over the 3 decades that he was the urban planning czar for the city, from the Depression up until he was still Parks Commissioner in the early 1960s, He was very proud to count off, and anytime he could, the number of playgrounds that he had built in the city. By some counts, it was 580. By others, and this one I think is accurate, it was 758. Oh, damn. Okay, well, that's fine. Have it that way. Hopefully we can come back to some of this later in the discussion, because there's a lot to be said about the relationship between what happened in Bedford-Stuyvesant in 1966 and how that was sort of an incubational moment that helped explode this playground revolution from Bed-Stuy to the Lower East Side and ultimately to Harlem, not ultimately, within months in Harlem, and led to the creation of all sorts of spaces and the concentration on vacant lots and unused spaces that Smokehouse naturally gravitated towards as platforms, as stage sets, as backdrops for their work. I will leave it there and hand out copies of the other 72 pages of this for later. Okay, thank you.
Oh, right, okay, yeah, let me get to my slides.
You can do a flip of that if you like.
I have specific slides that
I'm sorry.
oh, okay, sorry. So my timer, because I like to be able to see. Or maybe not, it's fine. Okay. Great, well, good evening, everyone. Thank you to both organizations for this invitation, and a special thanks to Eric for this massive effort and labor of love and beautiful project. I was really grateful to work on this book, not only because the Smokehouse Associates are artists that I deeply respect, but also because it allowed another entry point to some of the ideas and questions I've grappled with both in my curatorial and doctoral life, specifically as it concerns discourses and definitions around Black radical practice, especially as it emerged in the late 1960s and early 70s. So I thought I could talk about terminology today, shared and discrepant languages around art practices. When I contribute to catalogs or books, I usually take great thrill in naming my essays. It's also how I feel about exhibitions. On the one hand, it's just fun to play with language. But on the other, it presents this challenge of succinctness and clarity. Titles are a way of summing things up and making that thesis clear. And after doing the interview with Mel and William and Guy, all of whom I respect so much, I remember telling Eric, I can't title this introduction. Perhaps for the first time ever, I just left it. But it was for a specific reason, as it was a kind of marker of a determination to leave some things undefined and open. That what was happening here with Smokehouse kind of belied language or certain terms that are often mapped onto the work that looks something like theirs. So as you'll see in the catalog, the Smokehouse Associates disregarded the term mural. They rejected, in fact, favoring the term painted wall instead. And as I've come to understand the difference, the disavowal of mural was in part a means of separating oneself from practices grounded in representationals, of course. So when you think about murals, you think of people, representational images of persons. And this may be particularly true for the historical context in which these works were completed, because of course, concurrent with these works was a kind of explosion of murals across the United States, as articulated in the Black Power movement and its aesthetic iterations, of which the Wall of Respect is a key one. And this work in Chicago, organized by OBC, Organization of Black American Culture, really took up the explicit aim of uplift through the representation of notable individuals within Black culture across music, theater, sports, what have you. But further, the distinction is not only a way of differentiating from representation as such, but also decidedly against this idea of the mural as a static practice, something to be taken and seen rather than what the painted wall suggests, which is experience, integration. And over the course of our conversation, we kind of agreed on one term, which was conduit, painted wall as conduit. Conduit, we surmise, could point more faithfully to this idea of the painted work. What would it mean to see a painted wall not as something to just be walked by, but integrated, glimpsed from afar, kind of brought into one's bodily experience, really? Indeed, the plain language of the painted walls seems to speak to this activity because even within the terminology itself, painted, there's action, even if it's in past tense. So conduit refuses this kind of fixity of subjects. At the same time, however, I want to extend the possibility that within the 1960s, this idea of the conduit is one that was shared, even if differently, across practices that might initially seem discrepant from one another, including those most politically strident of the Black Power movement. And I think one way of seeing this, understanding this, is through a look at the aesthetics of the reflective surface, is what I'm calling it. I've been kind of fixated on silver paint used by the Smokehouse Associates, and it's actually a design feature of the catalog, which Eric can maybe talk about. So they did not use it all the time, and my understanding of their process around choosing colors and composition is that they were both informed and worked over, but not entirely systemized. But in select paint walls, you do find it. This metallicness, in its very nature, shimmers in the light, flashes, gleams. If the painted wall is a kind of action, the reflective surface amplifies this, necessary extending pigment into a third dimension. Embedded within it is the very idea of activity, movement, the passage of time. It activates before the activator, actually. And so I've been really enamored by this idea of silver paint for this reason. That even without, and there are various levels of reflectivity, but even without full reflectivity, it calls forth the promise of the reflection. And it speaks back, I think, to the overall ethos of the group, specifically as it concerns the idea of the conduit. The silver reflective surface is both a feature of the wall work, but it's also kind of thesis of the painted wall at the same time. And it is through its ontological activeness that I see a path to kind of seeing their work in conversation with unlikely bedfellows, members of Afrocobra. Following the dissolution of OBC, some of the members of that group went on to form another pretty famous collective within this history, Afrocobra, African Coalition of Bad Relevant Artists. In 1968, Jeff Donaldson, Barbara Jones-Kogu, Wadsworth-Terrell, and Gerald Williams. And today I'm just going to show some work by Wadsworth, but the work of Afrocobra, as you can see here, largely defined by this bright, effusive color, and at the same time deliberately political aims. These self-described Kool-Aid colors in the service of representations of Black individuals, many of whom are political leaders, both real and generalized, or Black families. You find women with afros, armed with rifles, reflections of Black is beautiful important to Afrocoba is something that the members of Smokehouse disavow, and that's figuration, of course. But also specific kinds of political aims as tethered to their art practices. But as Jeff Donaldson describes of Afrocobra, quote, "This is poster art, images which deal with concepts that offer positive and feasible solutions to our individual, local, national, international, and cosmic problems." So there are clear differences in approach, genre, aims, politics, but in what ways, I think, I'm asking, can we understand a shared language? Amidst this vibrantly patterned portrait of the so-called liberation soldiers, the image on the left, you see jackets of 2 of the 5 men depicted departing from the acrylic that defines the rest of the image. Their shoulders shimmering in foil. What I see in this use of foil is something quite similar to how I read Silver's use in the work of the Smokehouse Associates, this kind of vibrating energy. It announces and enacts the desire for an active rather than passive way of seeing or experiencing. This foil material, I think, helps open up to a larger conversation around the goals and philosophies of the Afrocobra group, and especially what I was thinking, that bears greater understanding and interrogation. While making figurative work, it's important to keep in mind that figuration is not necessarily static either, but can also express the desire for certain kinds of effects and changes. Can it be understood as a conduit? Indeed, I would argue that the foil becomes a way to concretize this philosophy, but in general, it's one that is integral. This idea of the conduit is integral to Afrocobra as a group, even beside that specific aesthetic element. Bright, buzzing, intricate, relying upon the geometric and the fractal, Afrocobra articulated an idea of portraiture that was always already about change. In Afrocobra Manifesto, 10 Inserts of the Nation, Jeff Donaldson articulates these precepts in part through the language of music. Symmetry that is, quote, symmetry that is free, repetition with change, based on African music and African movement, the rhythm that is easy, syncopation, very, very human, uncontracted, the rhythm. And he also does through the language of the super real, a term I think that gets at this kind of image making that seeks to engage this multi-dimensionality, this time-based kind of encounter. Color that shines, color that is free of rules and regulations, color that shines, color that is expressively awesome, color that defines, identifies, and directs. Surreal color for super real images, the super reality that is our everyday, all-day thing. Color as bright and as real as the color dealing on the streets of Watts and the South Side and 4th Street and in Roxbury and in Harlem, etc. Kool-Aid colors for Kool-Aid images for super real people. Super real images for super real people. This revisionary language, I think, and this call to understand a kind of more expansive definition of what figuration can mean, is made more succinct perhaps through another expression by Donaldson around what Afrocobra was up to, and it concerns this idea of the mimetic. So he calls the work of Afrocobra, quote, mimesis at midpoint, design that marks the spot where the real and the unreal, the objective and the non-objective, the plus and the minus meet. A point exactly between absolute abstractions and absolute naturalism. And so through color and form, end quote, through color and form, these images, I argue, help clarify or redefine what we mean by racial uplift. Not just a matter of seeing them, but I think being physically changed by them, charged, enlightened, not only on an ideological, but a bodily physical level. Like the Smokehouse painted walls, a shared desire to impact the site of encounter. And I just want to close with a kind of second disavowal of the Smokehouse Associates, and over the course of our conversation in the discussion of the conduit, I found myself asking about the question of minimalism. So much of the language of the conduit felt aligned with that of minimalism, performance art, all of these concurrent movements which were marked by this integration between art and viewer. The point was in the experience, how one is aware of one's body, and that you essentially complete the piece. And so when I asked about that, I got a resounding no. We weren't thinking of them, hence the no title. But I still couldn't help but think of, especially Robert Morris's Untitled Mirror of Cubes, constituted entirely by the idea that you see yourself reflected in the piece, and thus you activate the work and it activates you. And as much as there is not a connection, a deliberate connection, what I'm interested in is keeping the significance of, while at the same time I'm interested in keeping the significance of these differences close, what I hope the discourse of the conduit, by way of the reflective surface and other markers of the multi-dimensional can offer, is that at least a kind of new or more nuanced way of understanding the 1960s in particular, and by extension its legacy and impact thereafter. That the states of the 1960s, the various states of the 1960s, in terms of political and social context globally and nationally, pressed upon artists a certain level of urgency that resulted in a desire to explode the ontology of the art itself and completely do away with the idea of art as a closed form, merely for the purpose of perusal and no more. And while accomplished in vastly different ways and with different practices arising from different origin points and with different goals in mind, nonetheless, I think there's a shared deep desire for our work to do more, to be more, for people, to people, conduits to new kinds of consciousness, whatever that consciousness may be. Thank you.
So we're just going to take a moment and assemble the panel. Alright. First of all, thank you, Ashley, James, and Charles. Those presentations were amazing. And I am left a little speechless, although I should be, because you all have opened up so many dimensions in which to think about this work. That's both evident in your contributions in the book and then and then also in your presentations tonight. And I thought that maybe we could start there. And you answered a lot of the questions that I kind of had preloaded for this conversation, but you've also given us so much to go deeper in, which I'm really excited about. So, I think as we all have shown tonight, as you'll see in the book, we started off in kind of these disparate studies or locations and kind of entry points into the work. But I think what is tried and true, and what we all found in different ways, is that Smokehouse is boundary defying. And that sort of required a boundary defying sort of approach in the way that this history is told, thought about, and contextualized. Melvin Edwards has said in this is in the roundtable quote, we step beyond protest to construct something new. That's, of course, in reference to the work that they were making at the time around the height of Black power and social realism and the struggle for civil rights and the sort of heightened political state in which they're using abstraction and working in the environment, and specifically in Harlem. And then, of course, William T. Williams has often said that, oh, quote, a work of art should have a life that encompasses a larger body of people. And so this sort of, kind of multiplicity or this boundary-defying approach is kind of within the DNA of the artists themselves and this work itself. And so, a very broad and expansive question to tackle a sort of not even expansive topic and body of work, but just how you each sort of entered into this work. And I think that came through in some of your presentations. But if you could talk about how Smokehouse first kind of entered into your practice, but also maybe how it changed your practices for better or worse. And I'll just pass the mic to whoever wants to speak. Oh, we have two mics.
I'll just say briefly, in relation to what you were saying about the work activating life. So it's not just sort of representational background abstract. It's not a disinterested kind of artwork. But it's also not just critique and protest, but it's engaged. And to me, that fits in very well with the discipline of architecture. Architecture is this kind of thing that's both a backdrop, but also a critical commentary on that, on the artwork and the realm in which it participates in. And so at least for me, when I was reading the interviews in the archives and about the process, the design process, they'd have a couple of sketches, they'd work with community leaders, but then they'd work in tandem with folks in the neighborhood. They borrow colors from the context itself. It reminded me of several things. So one, it reminded me of sort of this 1960s and 1970s practice of community engagement, which in schools of architecture today is, it's so practiced that it's almost rote. The things that they did come in advance of some of the community practices, or at least parallel them. So you have the architects relocating in Harlem and other groups that are doing similar things, but the way that their practice was sort of anchored in a kind of visual formalism and use that as the basis by which to touch the people versus separating the art and talking to the community to see what it is that they wanted, I thought was quite interesting and engaging and non-trauma. And one of the things that I think that a pitfall they avoided is that a lot of the community activist practices that I see in professional schools of architecture, you have someone who is the architect asking the public what it is they want. And the public is there. And in terms of making records, you could actually record their names and who they were and what their asks were. But we tend as a discipline to then abstract that and to say, this is what the community wanted. This is what the group wanted. And to me, that's like maintaining the separation between vernacular and avant-garde production. And I just see that break not present in the work. It's completely blurred. And there's a kind of co-authorship that I really appreciate in that work. The other thing I'll say, at least for me, is that in trying to chronicle African American contributions to the built environment, I consistently, as a historian, come against the problem of titles and what to identify people as. So, for example, Jean Jordan, who I mentioned in my presentation, she went to architecture school. She never went and got a license, but she did win the Rome Prize with the help of Buckminster Fuller because she collaborated with him. So she's involved in architecture, but she's not an architect. But she has architectural ideas. And to me, as I kept going backwards in history, tracing this problem in titles, we can go all the way back to the moment of professionalization in our field, when certain people are written out of the field. People who were black master builders, for example, were gaining practice, they were gaining access in this kind of post-vellum world. And now you have professionals in architecture introducing the idea of the gentleman architect, brought over from the French École des Beaux-Arts, which to me is a kind of, signature colonial practice, right? It's a state institution introduced to formalize French state architecture, both in the metropole and in the satellite. And that's what we use as the model for our practice. So for me, it's really hard to look at architecture as a disciplinary space that was actually welcoming of the Black creative spirit. And so I feel like it's a discipline that needs to be complicated in the way that Smokehouse is. It needs to be bent in terms of who the author is. And I think that they're a really good model. And so, I both offer it as a kind of model for a new archive that we can rediscover, but also one that, by being documented, forcibly bends the hegemonic practice. Because you can't look at the architect as a kind of neutral professional category. It's a racialized category, particularly within the United States. So within that space, including Smokehouse, forces us to see the whiteness of the discipline and the ways that Black practitioners have consistently built the built environment, regardless of this exclusion. And it is to our peril to exclude them from that archive. So for me, it's a tremendous example. And I feel like, you went into the very fine points of artistic categorization, and I detected those things. But when I read and look at the work, it just feels architectural. Like it feels like an architectural archive that we should be more responsible for, and we should also offer kind of counter-narrative for. So now I'm rambling, right? So let me just share.
No, and Charles, just I think to respond to that, I think what you're saying is really a redressing of an understanding of academic fields, and I think that that's something that was coming up consistently in each of your presentations tonight, right? Actually calling for new language or ahistorical language, and James, this sort of idea of re-excavating these materials that exist outside of an institution or any kind of canonical archives. So there's this sort of unearthing of new histories and new languages that need to be had in order to do this work and the work of Black artists and architects, justice. I don't know if anybody else from the original question, or we can move on.
Do you want to move on to another question?
If you had any other questions, but if not.
Yeah. Just quickly to
Please.
just to add on really to that, to who gets written out, is something that I came across in, as a major problem in conducting my research about the history of play and play spaces and how it affected urban design and new approaches to urban space and where the spaces were being made, because there were obvious gaps, right? That's what I meant by that road to Damascus moment, when I actually found the glue or the missing Lego piece that I knew existed. It had to exist, but where had it been? And if you read, such as they are, the standard histories of parks, playgrounds, vest pocket parks, that whole history of the 60s, again, it's not a vast historical, recapitulation, but there's something that's missing. And the way it gets fed back, traditionally, is always this white liberal do-gooderism, people coming in from nonprofits and downtown advocacy groups parachuting into Brooklyn, Bed-Stuy, Central Brooklyn, Harlem, the Lower East Side, and through their beneficence, skill, education, talent, changing everything for everyone. And I realized, no, that wasn't actually the more I dug. And Smokehouse was I think the spark, the inspirational spark that actually made me think, no, you have to dig deeper and find out more. And it part of what I would have gotten to if I'd had more time. Just as one example, the Vast Pocket Park movement, it began both in Harlem and in Bedside at the same time, but that it wasn't a top-down movement, it was a so-called bottom-up movement. It was it was initiated by the residents of Bedside, by the leadership of Bedside, by the Central Brooklyn Coordinating Committee, which was this amazing organization that brought together incredibly disparate groups of people living and who had been living for generations in Bedside. They were the only people holding Bedside together because the city had given up on Bedside. It was their demand for Vast Pocket Parks in particular, and to make alliances with, say, Pratt Institute and certain key innovative playground designers and so forth, and to get the Pratt students to design these murals, painted walls, and the same thing in Harlem. But it's just remarkable how that story actually still has not been told. So.
Yeah, well, and I think just to go off of what you're saying, James, maybe to dig into your presentation a little more, because I love the question that you posed maybe at the beginning. Is art play and play is art, or which is which? And that kind of made me think of sort of a subsequent question within that question, which is, what is the sort of relationship between play and liberation? If we're thinking about this moment in the late 60s, you have a sort of kind of deep research and knowledge of how the urban play movement has shaped the city. But there are these many things, as we're seeing tonight, these intersecting histories and movements that are happening alongside each other, civil rights, and so forth, that, I wonder about, this question of a correlation or intersection between play and liberation, and if that kind of brings about any thoughts for you.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I thought of was the fact that the Harlem iteration, the most prominent example I can think of, was the 128th Street project, which was an initiative to create 3 Vast Pocket Parks at the same time on one block to see what would happen. They were divided into a young kids park, a teenagery park, and an adults and everybody else park, all sort of down this corridor, 128th Street between Lenox and 5th. But it didn't stop there. The point was that it needed to be activated. The same thing happened. Pratt students and Columbia students from the schools of art and design were invited to come and paint, but also to teach the kids and youth of those neighborhoods practices and skills for how to do it themselves. So they ended up doing the paintings, and they were likewise.
And in the book, you drew some sort of parallel histories between William attending Pratt and what was going on at the time.
Exactly, because at the same time that was happening in Harlem, the Vast Pocket Parks that you began to see there, William was at Pratt the very same, his final semester was when that Vast Pocket Park was being built, and when the pretty amazing geometric abstract murals were covering every surface of a very complicated sort of through block Vast Pocket Park, which was meant to connect to more and more and more best practice parks if the plan proceeded accordingly. William Bill, as you know, because we tried to get it out of him, he disavowed any involvement, even though he was there. But Billy Rose was there, and he had still 2 more years to go, and jury's still out on whether he was involved. But the point being that up in Harlem, those best pocket parks didn't stop just being play, which is very much what they were. They became cultural hubs. They became event spaces. A formerly very dead street, which had the only anchor thing that was holding it was a church, and they became the sponsor for these parks. They hired to be the program director for these 3 best pocket parks, a man named Tony Lawrence. And if you've seen Summer of Soul, Tony Lawrence started the Harlem Cultural Festival in one of these tiny best pocket parks. It started as something for the youth of that street and neighboring streets to play music, play their own music, play their own instruments, to learn about African culture, Caribbean culture, and it grew exponentially each summer until I was 65, until 4 years later it became what it was and has now been amazingly documented in that film. So, politics, play, art, space.
All of the above. Yeah. Ashley, I wonder if we could talk a little bit about your presentation and particularly your conversation with the artists in the book. And you drew out some of the things that I was hoping we could talk through tonight, the sort of various tension points with language, with the sort of mention of minimalism and conceptualism, drawing the same sort of response as the word mural did with Melvin. And I wondered if you could talk specifically from the kind of role as a curator, but also an art historian, and sort of the responsibilities of doing this type of work and the sort of challenges that sit at the intersection of so many things. I think one thing that really excited me in your presentation was this idea of unlikely bedfellows, right? So Obasi, Oeusi, Smokehouse, all sort of sitting within the same kind of milieu, and as history kind of unfolds, becomes sort of calcified over time. But maybe digging into sort of like the nuances of that and drawing out some of the relationships as you did. So, one, I guess, speaking from my own experience, kind of digging into this project, is how challenging this work was for all the reasons we said, but then also too because it asked me to kind of go deeper, to untether some of maybe the things that were previously tethered, maybe in other accounts of the late 60s and Black radicalism. So I wonder if you could talk through maybe some of these unlikely bedfellows that you mentioned, and just how you continue to kind of approach this in your own work.
I spoke about the tensions around terminology. I think artists in general, want you to be as specific as you possibly can be around their work. And for the purposes of something like this book, I obviously was very invested in getting it correct, because part of this is about kind of like setting the record straight and being the it's the only book on the group, and for that purpose, it's important for a really delicate touch around language. I'm definitely not afraid to ask the question of how are you thinking about these other discourses, because, I have a long-standing interest in kind of redefining what political engagement looks like. I think that that's partially why I'm really interested in the late 1960s and particularly the early 1970s, because a lot of weird things happen. And I think there are a lot of assumptions made about what it is that political artists are doing when they make figurative work, when they produce a play, when they...
And if they're political at all.
Yes, and if they're political at all. But specifically for the ones that get named as political, Amiri Baraka's a great example for me, and I didn't get to the slide on his work. But I think in terms of working on a project that is not about reflecting with as great a detail of what and how an artist sees their own practice, and it's about me kind of like taking that and attempting to synthesize it and draw out commonalities. Work like Smokehouse really interests me because it allows, I think it offers up such rich, just concepts around like what an artwork can do, but I don't think that they're the only ones who are thinking in that way. Or maybe there's a keyword that emerges from them that then can then spark every engagement with something else. And that's what I'm interested in doing in my practice. And so kind of seeing Afro-Cobra alongside Smokehouse, as I suggest, is I think about getting at this experimentation that pries open what change looks like. I don't think that for painters in Afro-Cobra, I don't think for the black aesthetic, black arts movement artist Amiri Baraka, it's so simple as kind of like, actually, I don't even know what the simple version would be because it often is undefined.
And there's no simple version.
There is no simple version.
And when you bring up Amiri Baraka, too, I always kind of go back and thinking about Smokehouse. The fact that some of these artists had personal relationships. William had a personal relationship with Amiri Baraka and his family. And, I think that kind of speaks to the sort of messiness or weirdness, as you kind of said, of that moment of reality, that, all of these artists are living and working together in this space, in this charged sort of moment, and thinking about different forms of play, different forms of liberation, and different forms of sort of collective and communal work. And so I think that, what you're saying and what is really resonating with me is this idea that art historians, curators really need to sort of pry open the cracks to get at some of the intricacies in the ways that these groups, these artists, these movements really speak to each other, but also transcend, a sort of calcified or quote-unquote movement or name subject.
Yes, exactly. And they were also moving beyond these various mediums too, and we're not thinking in a box of a specific movement that is belatedly ascribed. So it's almost like going back to that initial kind of understanding of how art gets made. It's not through a title, it's not through certain kinds of generic constraints.
And you touch on that a little bit, right, in your intro, in talking about the sort of inherent use in interaction with Smokehouse's work, but then also looking at the work of artists at that time and how there's this sort of inherent notion, an Afro-diasporic notion of art as a sort of shared communal experience, right?
And I mean, for their part, as much as I know that Mel does, well, I don't know, I don't think I even talked about Afro-Cobra during that interview because I didn't think we were even going to go there, but Mel always says that, everything is abstract.
Yes.
So he believes that too.
Except for when a baby is born.
Except for when a baby is born, is that what it says. And that's how I see it. It's all abstract. I mean, these are elements, being the kind of impulses behind, and like the like high concept idea of like what can this thing do in the world. I'm really interested in those kinds of questions, and that's where I see connections across disparate practices.
Yeah, absolutely. I think maybe I'll just pose sort of a closing question for us, because I want to make sure that we open it up to questions in the audience. And I think you kind of led us there, Ashley, in thinking about just what Smokehouse offers us now within this contemporary moment as we think of this work 50 years plus later. How is there a certain sense of clarity that the contemporary moment is bringing to it? And then also to, I think, how does the work of Smokehouse maybe identify itself, or have you seen it identify itself in collective work, in particular artists who are working in a certain modality or spirit today? And I think, Charles, like you brought up some great examples already as well in your project of the Black Space Archive.
So I think that there is that work and a broader archive of Black experimentation that goes back. I think it's understudied and underdocumented. But this conversation makes me think about this notion of play that you mentioned earlier, and the ways that certain artistic institutions, particularly within minority communities, start within these play spaces. So think about like El Museo starting in a gymnasium, the long history of the Black gymnasium and the public school being the place where communities come to discuss things. Like, to me, that it provides a kind of material backdrop to the political experimentation that I think is happening. And so this moment, I think, is rich with political experimentation, and that political experimentation is connected to artistic expression. So we have, like, the Black bourgeoisie, the Black civil rights movement, we have the reaction of the Black nationalists, and there's a sense, for me anyway, that they're experimenting with different forms of democracy and different forms of expression for different communities. And there's a really complex understanding of which class hierarchies are overrepresented in artistic notions of Blackness, which ones are more connected to folks on the ground in those place spaces that allow for them to know what their everyday rhythms are versus sort of what the nation understands as the political forms of representation for that group. And so for me, anyway, in this political moment, where we're protracted, and I think, there's a sense that just because we're getting news 24 hours a day that we know everything that's happening, but then the humility with which we return to the archive to understand what it is that we missed. I have a strong faith that we're missing a lot now. There's probably a lot of experimentation that's happening now that would give us hope for what could happen, as opposed to the doom that we have present. And I say this, having moved to Texas, where there's a lot of reason to have, pessimism. But as I'm learning about the history, though, I also realize that there's a lot of freedom towns that were created and that have disappeared and only exist through ephemeral archives. Like Black people have always resisted and found ways to make their democratic space. And so I'm at least emboldened by that. I think that that's something that this helps me to realize in this way.
Well, and one thing about that, Charles, that I wrote down when you were speaking is this idea of like collective work as change work. And this is something that comes from a citation in the book by Oakley and Laser, who has cited how these collectives form in these great moments of upheaval, but in doing so, they not only kind of destabilize a sort of modernist notion of a single object or a single artist, but force a sort of recalibration or reevaluation across the board, right, of medium, of practices, of art in and of itself. So, I think that you kind of gave us some positive, hopeful notes to consider in in this moment. I don't know if anybody else has thoughts before we open it up for some questions.
Yeah, I would be mindful. We lost one of our interpreters, and I would be thoughtful to be.
Let's.
But if you want to ask questions after, maybe our panelists, if they're willing to stay just for a little bit, if you want to directly speak to them.
Okay, well, thank you all so much for gathering tonight. And please